In the depths of enemy territory, when technology fails and hope fades, sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected hands. This is the true story of how one woman's courage and determination became the difference between life and death for an elite military unit. When sophisticated equipment failed and extraction seemed impossible, she did what no one thought possible, manually activating a beacon that would either save them all or seal their fate forever. What started as a routine intelligence-gathering mission in hostile territory quickly turned into a nightmare that would test every limit of human endurance, trust, and survival. This is not just a story about military operations. It's about the extraordinary power of the human spirit when everything else falls apart. The morning air in eastern Afghanistan carried the scent of dust and danger as Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez checked her equipment for the third time. The intelligence analyst had been attached to SEAL Team 7 for what command called a routine reconnaissance mission. Nothing about operating behind enemy lines ever felt routine to her, but she had learned to trust the calm confidence of the special operations warriors around her. Team leader Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison gathered his 6-man team around a makeshift planning table constructed from ammunition crates. The base camp buzzed with the controlled energy that preceded every mission. Helicopters circled overhead, their rotors cutting through the thin mountain air, while ground crews made final preparations for what would become one of the most harrowing rescue operations in recent military history. Intelligence suggests a high-value target is operating from this compound, Morrison said, pointing to aerial photographs spread across the crates. The images showed a remote facility nestled in a valley surrounded by jagged peaks. Our job is to get in, gather intelligence, and get out without being detected. Rodriguez studied the photographs with the trained eye of someone who had spent years analyzing terrain and enemy positions. The compound sat in what tactical planners called a bowl, a natural depression surrounded by higher ground that could quickly become a trap if things went wrong. Multiple escape routes had been planned, but she noticed how the terrain seemed to funnel any movement through narrow passes that could be easily monitored or blocked. Chief Petty Officer David Chin, the team's communications specialist, ran through the equipment list one final time. Each team member carried multiple backup communication devices, GPS units, and emergency beacons. Technology was state-of-the-art, designed to function in the harshest environments and most challenging conditions. Rodriguez carried her own specialized equipment for intelligence gathering, including cameras, recording devices, and analysis tools that would help identify the target and gather crucial information about his operations. The helicopter insertion went smoothly. The aircraft approached the landing zone using terrain masking techniques, flying low through valleys and around peaks to avoid detection by enemy radar or observation posts. Rodriguez felt her stomach drop as the pilot executed sharp turns in sudden altitude changes, but she had learned to trust the skill of military aviators who specialized in these types of operations. As they approached the landing zone, Morrison gave final instructions through the aircraft's internal communication system. We go in fast, establish security, and move to the observation point. Rodriguez, you'll have 30 minutes maximum to gather intelligence once we reach the compound. Any longer and we risk compromise. The team fast-roped from the helicopter into a rocky clearing approximately 2 miles from their target. Rodriguez hit the ground running, her equipment secured tightly to prevent noise or snagging. The team immediately established a defensive perimeter, while Morrison confirmed their position using GPS coordinates. The helicopter disappeared quickly, leaving them alone in hostile territory with only their training, equipment, and each other for protection. The approach to the compound took nearly 3 hours. The team moved through terrain that seemed designed to challenge every aspect of their training. Rocky outcroppings provided cover, but made movements slow and treacherous. Narrow ravines offered concealment, but also potential ambush sites. Rodriguez marveled at the skill with which the SEALs navigated these challenges, communicating through hand signals and moving with a coordination that spoke to hundreds of hours of training together. Petty Officer First Class Mike Sullivan, the team sniper, took point as they approached the final observation position. His job was to identify potential threats and provide overwatch as the team established their surveillance post. Through her scope, Rodriguez could see the compound coming into view. The intelligence photographs had been accurate, but seeing the location in person revealed details that aerial reconnaissance had missed. The compound was larger than expected, with multiple buildings connected by covered walkways. Guards patrolled the perimeter with the disciplined movement of trained fighters, not the casual wandering of militia members. Rodriguez immediately began photographing the layout, noting defensive positions, communication equipment, and what appeared to be a command center housed in the largest building. Chief Chen established communication with their command base using a sophisticated radio system designed to transmit encrypted signals through satellite links. The equipment represented millions of dollars of research and development, engineered to function reliably in environments where communication could mean the difference between successful mission completion and catastrophic failure. "Overwatch, this is Team 7, Chen whispered into his headset. "We are in position and beginning intelligence gathering operations." The response came back immediately. "Team 7, Overwatch copies. You are cleared for intelligence gathering. Extraction remains scheduled for 0300 hours at primary landing zone." Rodriguez felt the familiar focus that came with active intelligence operations. Through her high-powered camera lens, she began documenting everything visible within the compound. The target himself remained elusive, but the intelligence value of the facility became immediately apparent. Maps visible through windows suggested operational planning for activities throughout the region. Communication equipment indicated coordination with other locations. Vehicle movements suggested supply lines and operational patterns that could prove valuable for future operations. Petty Officer Second Class Tony Martinez, the team's explosive ordnance specialist, studied the compound's defenses from a different perspective. His job was to identify potential threats and plan emergency procedures if the mission required rapid extraction under hostile conditions. The guards carried weapons that suggested serious training and substantial resources. Their movement patterns indicated familiarity with the terrain and established procedures for responding to potential threats. As the afternoon wore on, Rodriguez gathered intelligence that exceeded their mission expectations. Photographs revealed documents that appeared to contain operational plans for activities across multiple provinces. Communication intercepts suggested coordination with organizations that had previously been considered separate entities. The intelligence value continued to grow, but so did the risks of extended exposure in their current position. Morrison monitored the situation with the calm professionalism that had earned him command of one of the military's most elite units. His job was to balance mission success against team safety, making decisions that could affect not only their immediate survival, but also broader strategic operations throughout the region. The intelligence Rodriguez was gathering clearly had significant value, but staying in position also increased their risk of detection and compromise. The team's medic, Petty Officer Second Class Lisa Park, monitored the physical condition of team members during the extended surveillance operation. The altitude, temperature extremes, and stress of operating behind enemy lines took a toll that could affect performance and decision-making. Her job was to ensure that everyone remained capable of executing their roles and responding effectively to changing circumstances. As evening approached, Rodriguez completed her initial intelligence gathering objectives. The photographs and recordings she had obtained would provide analysts with information that could influence operations throughout the region for months to come. The mission appeared to be proceeding exactly according to plan, with extraction scheduled to occur in just a few hours. Chen maintained regular communication with their command base, providing updates on mission progress and confirming extraction procedures. The radio equipment functioned flawlessly, providing clear communication despite their remote location and challenging terrain. Everything seemed to be working exactly as trained and planned. The first indication that something was wrong came from Sullivan's observation post. Through his sniper scope, he noticed increased activity around the compound's communication center. Guards who had been following routine patrol patterns began moving with greater urgency. Vehicle movements increased, and lights that had been following predictable schedules began staying on continuously. "Team leader, we may have increased activity in the compound," Sullivan reported through his headset. "Recommend we prepare for potential compromise." Morrison acknowledged the report and began implementing contingency procedures. The team's training included extensive preparation for situations where missions needed to be modified or abandoned based on changing circumstances. Their extraction point was confirmed, backup communication procedures were reviewed, and everyone prepared for the possibility that their mission might need to end earlier than planned. Rodriguez continued her intelligence-gathering operations, but now with heightened awareness of the changing situation around them. The information she was obtaining remained valuable, but the team's safety took priority over any intelligence objectives. She began preparing her equipment for rapid movement, while continuing to document everything possible within the remaining time available. The sun was setting behind the mountains when Chen first noticed problems with their communication equipment. Static began interfering with transmissions that had been crystal clear just hours earlier. GPS readings that had been precise began showing inconsistencies. Equipment that had functioned perfectly during insertion began displaying error messages and system failures. "Team leader, I'm showing multiple equipment failures," Chen reported. "Communication is becoming intermittent, and GPS is showing position errors." Morrison moved to Chen's position to assess the situation personally. Multiple pieces of equipment were displaying problems simultaneously, which suggested either environmental interference or deliberate jamming by hostile forces. The implications were serious. Without reliable communication and navigation equipment, extraction would become significantly more challenging. Park checked her medical equipment and found similar problems. Electronic devices that had been functioning normally were now showing power fluctuations and system errors. Even equipment with independent power sources was being affected, which suggested some form of electromagnetic interference rather than simple equipment failure. Martinez examined his specialized equipment and found the same pattern of failures. Devices that had been tested extensively and functioned reliably in training were now malfunctioning simultaneously. The timing and scope of the failures suggested deliberate interference, which meant their position might have been compromised. Rodriguez continued her intelligence operations while monitoring the team's growing equipment problems. Her camera equipment was also beginning to malfunction, with electronic components showing the same type of errors that were affecting communication and navigation systems. The intelligence she had already gathered remained secure, but her ability to continue operations was becoming limited. Sullivan maintained his overwatch position, while reporting continued increases in activity around the compound. The number of guards had increased significantly, and their movement patterns suggested preparation for some type of operation. Vehicles that had been parked were now being started and moved to different positions. The compound was clearly preparing for something. Chen worked frantically to restore communication with their command base. Years of training and experience with communication equipment helped him identify potential solutions and workarounds for the equipment failures they were experiencing. However, the scope and simultaneity of the problems suggested challenges that went beyond normal troubleshooting procedures. The team faced a situation that their training had prepared them for but hoped they would never encounter. They were deep in hostile territory with compromised equipment, potential enemy knowledge of their position, and limited time before their scheduled extraction. The decisions made in the next few hours would determine whether they completed a successful mission or became casualties of a failed operation. Morrison gathered his team for what could be their final planning session. The mission that had started as routine intelligence gathering had become a survival situation that would test every aspect of their training, equipment, and determination. The evening was about to become much longer and more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. The electromagnetic interference intensified as darkness fell across the Afghan mountains. Rodriguez watched her team members struggle with equipment that had functioned flawlessly just hours before. The sophisticated technology that formed the backbone of modern special operations was failing systematically, leaving them increasingly isolated in hostile territory. Chen's attempts to establish communication with their command base grew more desperate as each backup system succumbed to the same mysterious interference. The radio equipment that had provided clear, encrypted communication now produced only static and fragmented transmissions. GPS devices that had shown precise coordinates were now displaying location errors of several kilometers. "Team leader, I'm getting intermittent contact with Overwatch," Chen reported, his voice tight with frustration. "The signal keeps cutting out, and when it does connect, there's significant distortion." Morrison crouched beside Chen, watching him cycle through different frequencies in communication protocols. Years of experience had taught him to trust his team's expertise, but the current situation was beyond anything they had encountered in training or previous operations. Sullivan maintained his Overwatch position, but his reports grew more concerning with each passing hour. The compound below was transforming from a quiet intelligence target into what appeared to be a staging area for a major operation. Vehicles that had been absent during the day were returning with armed personnel. Communications equipment that had been inactive was now showing signs of intensive use. "Team leader, vehicle count is now up to 12, and I'm seeing at least 30 personnel," Sullivan whispered through his headset. "They're moving with purpose, not random patrol activity." Martinez worked on his own equipment, finding the same pattern of failures that was affecting the entire team. Electronic components were experiencing power fluctuations and system errors that suggested sophisticated jamming technology. The implications were troubling. Equipment failures of this scope and coordination indicated an adversary with significant technical capabilities. Rodriguez continued documenting everything she could observe, but her electronic equipment was also succumbing to the interference. Cameras that had been capturing high-quality intelligence imagery were now producing distorted images with significant digital artifacts. Recording equipment that had been functioning normally was now experiencing intermittent failures. The team's situation was deteriorating rapidly. They were losing their technological advantages at exactly the moment when those advantages had become most critical. The sophisticated equipment that enabled modern special operations was being systematically neutralized, forcing them to rely on basic training and fundamental survival skills. Park monitored the team's physical and psychological condition as the stress of their situation increased. Extended operations in hostile territory were challenging under normal circumstances, but equipment failures added layers of complexity that could quickly overwhelm even experienced operators. Her job was to ensure that everyone remained capable of making sound decisions and executing necessary actions. As midnight approached, Chen finally managed to establish brief contact with their command base. The transmission was heavily distorted and fragmented, but enough information came through to confirm their worst fears about the situation they were facing. Team 7 Overwatch. Came the broken transmission. Primary extraction point. Compromised. Enemy forces. Area. Alternative extraction. Coordinates. The transmission cut out before Chen could receive complete information about alternative extraction procedures. He tried repeatedly to re-establish contact, cycling through every available frequency and communication protocol, but the interference was now so severe that sustained communication appeared impossible. Morrison gathered his team for an emergency planning session. Their original mission parameters had assumed functioning communication equipment and established extraction procedures. With those assumptions no longer valid, they needed to develop alternative plans based on the resources and capabilities that remained available to them. "We have to assume that our position is either known or suspected," Morrison told his team. "Communication with Overwatch is compromised, and we don't have reliable information about extraction alternatives. We need to develop contingency plans based on what we can control." Rodriguez studied maps and terrain features while the team discussed their options. The compound they had been observing was clearly the center of increased enemy activity, but the nature and scope of that activity remained unclear. Her intelligence training helped her analyze the situation from multiple perspectives, considering both immediate tactical concerns and broader strategic implications. Sullivan continued his surveillance of the compound while participating in the planning discussion. His sniper training had taught him to maintain situational awareness across multiple timeframes, monitoring immediate threats while anticipating future developments. The activity he was observing suggested preparation for a significant operation, but the target and timing remained unknown. The team's training had prepared them for equipment failures and communication problems, but the scope and simultaneity of their current difficulties exceeded normal contingency planning. They were facing a situation that required improvisation based on fundamental principles rather than execution of predetermined procedures. Chen worked continuously to restore some form of communication capability. His technical expertise with communication systems was extensive, but the interference they were experiencing seemed designed specifically to defeat the types of equipment and frequencies used by Special Operations Forces. The sophistication suggested an adversary with detailed knowledge of American military communication systems. Martinez examined their weapons and non-electronic equipment, which continued to function normally. The interference affecting their communication and navigation systems did not seem to impact mechanical systems or simple electronic devices. This suggested that whatever was causing their problems was specifically targeting the sophisticated communication and navigation equipment that modern military operations depended upon. Rodriguez noticed patterns in the interference that suggested it was not entirely random. Electronic equipment failed in waves, with brief periods of normal function followed by intensive disruption. The timing and characteristics suggested deliberate jamming rather than environmental interference or simple equipment failure. Park monitored the team's stress levels and physical condition as the night progressed. Operating behind enemy lines was always challenging, but the loss of technological advantages added psychological pressure that could affect decision-making and performance. Her medical training included extensive preparation for maintaining team effectiveness under extreme stress. As the hours passed, the team's situation continued to deteriorate. What had begun as equipment problems was now clearly a coordinated effort to isolate and neutralize their capabilities. The timing and sophistication of the interference suggested an adversary who knew not only their location but also the specific equipment and procedures they were using. Sullivan observed increased activity around the compound throughout the night. Vehicles were moving in patterns that suggested coordination with other locations. Communication equipment was being used intensively, with antenna arrays being adjusted and repositioned frequently. The compound was clearly serving as a coordination center for activities that extended far beyond their immediate area. Morrison made the difficult decision to begin moving toward their primary extraction point, despite the communication problems. Staying in their current position offered no advantages and increased their risk of detection and engagement. Movement toward the extraction point would at least position them for possible pickup if communication could be re-established. The team began a careful withdrawal from their observation position, moving through terrain that had been challenging during daylight and was now treacherous in darkness. Electronic navigation aids that had been available during their insertion were no longer reliable, forcing them to rely on compass navigation and terrain recognition skills. Rodriguez carried her intelligence materials and equipment while participating in the tactical movement. The information she had gathered represented significant intelligence value, but its importance would be meaningless if the team could not successfully extract from their current situation. Her survival training helped her balance the competing priorities of mission success and team safety. Chen maintained attempts to establish communication while the team moved. His equipment was lighter and more portable than the main communication systems, but it was also less powerful and more susceptible to interference. The trade-offs between capability and mobility were becoming increasingly important as their situation evolved. The terrain they traversed was unforgiving, with loose rock that could cause noise or injury and steep slopes that required careful navigation. Electronic devices that had provided situational awareness during their insertion were now unreliable or completely non-functional. The team was operating with capabilities that would have been familiar to Special Operations Forces from decades earlier. Martinez monitored their rear security while they moved, watching for signs of pursuit or surveillance. His training had taught him to identify threats across multiple domains, from human tracking to electronic surveillance to aerial observation. The current situation required vigilance across all these areas simultaneously. Park assisted team members who were struggling with the physical demands of movement across difficult terrain in darkness. The combination of stress, equipment weight, and challenging navigation was taking a toll that could affect performance and decision-making. Her job was to ensure that everyone remained capable of contributing to their collective survival. As they approached the vicinity of their primary extraction point, Sullivan conducted advance reconnaissance to determine whether the area remained viable for helicopter operations. His observations would determine whether they could proceed with their original extraction plan or would need to implement alternative procedures. The extraction point was located in a natural clearing that had been selected for its accessibility to helicopter operations and defensibility against ground threats. Sullivan's reconnaissance revealed that the area appeared uncompromised, but without reliable communication equipment, they had no way to coordinate with potential extraction aircraft. Morrison positioned his team in a defensive perimeter around the extraction point, while Chen continued attempts to establish communication. The designated extraction time was approaching rapidly, but they had no confirmation that extraction aircraft would be dispatched without positive communication from the team. The night air carried sounds that suggested increased activity throughout the region. Vehicle movements, aircraft overflights, and distant communication signals indicated that military operations were occurring across a wide area. The team's situation was clearly part of a larger pattern of events that extended far beyond their immediate mission. Rodriguez analyzed their situation from an intelligence perspective, considering the broader implications of their current circumstances. The sophisticated nature of the interference affecting their equipment suggested adversaries with capabilities that exceeded previous estimates. The coordination and timing indicated planning and resources that represented a significant threat to future operations. Chen managed to establish brief contact with what might have been their command base, but the transmission was so distorted that confirmation was impossible. Electronic interference continued to defeat every attempt at sustained communication, leaving them isolated at exactly the moment when coordination had become most critical. The team waited at the extraction point as the designated pickup time approached and passed. Without positive communication to confirm their location and status, extraction aircraft would not risk approaching a potentially compromised landing zone. They were on their own in increasingly hostile territory with equipment that was becoming less reliable with each passing hour. Dawn broke grey and cold over the Afghan mountains, revealing the full scope of the team's predicament. Rodriguez watched Morrison study their tactical situation with the calm professionalism that had earned him command of one of the military's most elite units. The extraction that should have occurred hours earlier had never materialized, leaving them stranded deep in hostile territory, with failing equipment and no reliable communication with their command base. The primary extraction point had been compromised not by enemy action, but by their inability to coordinate pickup operations without functioning communication equipment. Aircraft could not risk approaching a landing zone without confirmation of team status and area security. The sophisticated jamming that had neutralized their electronic equipment was now preventing the very coordination that successful extraction required. Sullivan maintained overwatch positions as the team conducted tactical planning for their deteriorating situation. His sniper training had taught him to think in terms of multiple timeframes, considering immediate threats while anticipating developments that could affect their situation hours or days in the future. The activity he was observing throughout the region suggested a large-scale operation that extended far beyond their immediate area. Team leader, I'm seeing increased vehicle movement on the main access routes. Sullivan reported through the short-range communications that still functioned sporadically. Looks like organized search patterns rather than routine patrol activity. Morrison acknowledged the report while studying maps that showed potential routes to secondary extraction points. Their training had included extensive preparation for situations where primary extraction failed, but those contingency plans assumed functioning communication equipment and coordination with supporting units. Current circumstances were testing the limits of their preparation and resources. Chen continued working with communication equipment that was becoming increasingly unreliable. His technical expertise was extensive, but the interference they were experiencing seemed designed specifically to defeat American military communication systems. The sophistication and persistence of the jamming suggested adversaries with detailed knowledge of special operations equipment and procedures. Rodriguez packed her intelligence materials while participating in the team's planning discussion. The information she had gathered represented significant intelligence value. But its importance would be meaningless if they could not successfully extract from their current situation. Her survival training helped her balance mission objectives against immediate survival requirements. Martinez conducted a detailed assessment of their remaining equipment and supplies. The electromagnetic interference that was affecting their communication and navigation systems did not seem to impact basic equipment, like weapons, ammunition, and survival gear. This suggested that whatever was causing their problems was specifically targeting sophisticated electronic systems. Park monitored the team's physical condition and stress levels as they dealt with their increasingly challenging situation. Extended operations in hostile territory were difficult under normal circumstances, but equipment failures and communication problems added psychological pressure that could affect decision-making and performance over time. The team began moving toward their secondary extraction point, located approximately 15 kilometers away, through terrain that would challenge their navigation and movement capabilities. Electronic navigation aids that had been available during their insertion were no longer reliable, forcing them to depend on compass navigation and terrain recognition skills that had formed the foundation of special operations training for generations. Movement through the mountainous terrain was slow and physically demanding. Loose rock created noise and injury hazards, while steep slopes required careful route selection and movement techniques. The weight of equipment and supplies added to the physical challenge, particularly at the altitude where they were operating. Rodriguez participated in the tactical movement while carrying her intelligence equipment and materials. Her training had prepared her for the physical demands of operating with special operations units, but the current situation was testing her endurance and adaptation capabilities. The intelligence she had gathered remained valuable, but only if the team could successfully extract from their current situation. Sullivan took point during movement, using his reconnaissance training to identify potential threats and obstacles. His job was to provide early warning of enemy presence, while finding routes that balanced speed against concealment. The terrain they were traversing offered numerous opportunities for observation and ambush that required constant vigilance. Chen attempted to establish communication during rest halts, but the interference continued to defeat every system and frequency he tried. The jamming was not only sophisticated but also persistent, suggesting power sources and technical capabilities that exceeded previous threat estimates. The implications for future operations were troubling. Martinez maintained rear security while the team moved, watching for signs of pursuit or surveillance. His explosives expertise also made him responsible for identifying potential ambush sites and defensive positions that could be used if the team was forced into combat situations. The team's movement was complicated by the need to avoid populated areas and known enemy positions while navigating toward their secondary extraction point. Maps and intelligence reports provided general guidance, but the dynamic nature of enemy operations meant that threat locations could change rapidly. Park assisted team members who were struggling with the physical demands of extended movement across difficult terrain. The combination of stress, altitude, equipment weight, and challenging navigation was creating fatigue that could affect performance and decision-making. Her medical training included preparation for maintaining team effectiveness under extreme physical and psychological stress. As they approached the halfway point to their secondary extraction location, Sullivan identified what appeared to be an organized search operation in progress across multiple valleys. Vehicle movements, aircraft overflights, and communication intercepts suggested that enemy forces were conducting coordinated operations across a wide area. Team leader, this looks like a major search and rescue operation, Sullivan reported. Multiple assets operating in coordinated patterns across the entire region. Morrison studied Sullivan's observations while considering their tactical options. The scope and coordination of enemy activity suggested that their presence in the area was known or suspected. This meant that movement to extraction points would be more dangerous than originally planned, and extraction operations themselves would face increased opposition. Rodriguez analyzed the situation from an intelligence perspective, considering what enemy knowledge of their presence might indicate about operational security and mission compromise. The sophisticated jamming equipment and coordinated search operations suggested adversaries with capabilities that had been underestimated in mission planning. Chen managed to establish brief contact with what might have been their command base during the afternoon rest halt. The transmission was heavily distorted, but he received what sounded like confirmation that extraction operations were being planned despite communication difficulties. Team 7. Extraction. Secondary point. Unclear. Wait. Confirmation. The transmission faded before Chen could receive clear instructions, but the fragments suggested that their situation was known, and extraction efforts were underway. Martinez identified defensive positions that could be used if the team was detected and engaged during movement to their extraction point. His training had taught him to think tactically about terrain usage for both movement and combat operations. The current situation required preparation for multiple contingencies. The afternoon movement was complicated by increased enemy activity in areas they needed to traverse. Sullivan identified multiple vehicle checkpoints and patrol bases that had not been present during their insertion. The enemy response to their presence was more extensive and coordinated than their mission planning had anticipated. Rodriguez continued carrying her intelligence materials while participating in increasingly challenging tactical movement. The physical demands of the mission were testing her endurance, but the intelligence value of what she had gathered provided motivation to continue, despite growing fatigue and equipment problems. Park monitored team members for signs of exhaustion, dehydration, and stress-related performance degradation. The combination of physical exertion, psychological pressure, and equipment failures was creating conditions that could lead to mistakes or poor decisions. Her job was to ensure that everyone remained capable of contributing to their collective survival. As evening approached, the team was still several hours away from their secondary extraction point. Morrison made the difficult decision to continue movement through the night despite the additional risks, because remaining in their current area would expose them to the organized search operations that were intensifying throughout the region. Chen attempted communication during evening navigation, but the interference patterns had become even more sophisticated. Electronic equipment was experiencing failures that seemed coordinated with their movement, suggesting that their position might be known more precisely than they had initially believed. Sullivan observed increased aircraft activity that suggested aerial search operations were being conducted throughout their area of operations. The sophistication and persistence of enemy responses indicated capabilities and resources that exceeded intelligence estimates provided during mission planning. Martinez identified what appeared to be coordinated ground movement designed to establish blocking positions along potential extraction routes. The enemy was clearly implementing procedures designed to prevent extraction operations, which suggested detailed knowledge of American Special Operations tactics and procedures. The team's situation was becoming increasingly desperate as they approached their secondary extraction point. Equipment failures were making navigation and communication more difficult, while enemy responses were becoming more sophisticated and coordinated. The mission that had begun as routine intelligence gathering had evolved into a survival situation that was testing every aspect of their training and capabilities. Rodriguez maintained focus on preserving the intelligence materials she had gathered while dealing with the physical and psychological challenges of their deteriorating situation. The information represented significant intelligence value, but its importance would be meaningless if the team could not successfully extract from hostile territory. Park continued monitoring team condition while they approached what might be their final opportunity for extraction. The stress and physical demands of their situation were approaching the limits of human endurance, even for personnel trained for extreme conditions. The next few hours would determine whether their training and equipment would be sufficient to ensure their survival. Morrison led his team toward their secondary extraction point with the knowledge that failure to extract during the next opportunity would leave them stranded in hostile territory with failing equipment and increasingly sophisticated enemy opposition. The decisions made during the next few hours would determine whether they completed a successful mission or became casualties of an operation that had exceeded all planning assumptions. The secondary extraction point lay in a narrow valley that had seemed ideal during mission planning, but now felt like a potential trap. Rodriguez crouched beside Morrison as he studied the terrain through night vision equipment that was still functioning, despite the electromagnetic interference that had crippled their communication systems. The valley offered helicopter access and defensible positions, but it also provided limited escape routes if enemy forces managed to surround their position. Sullivan had been conducting reconnaissance of the extraction area for the past hour, and his reports were not encouraging. The organized search operations they had observed throughout the region were converging on their general area. Vehicle movements and aircraft overflights suggested that enemy forces were systematically checking potential extraction sites throughout the mountains. Team leader, I count at least 6 vehicle positions within observation range of the extraction point, Sullivan whispered through their short-range communications. They're not actively patrolling, but they're positioned to observe and respond to aircraft activity. Morrison processed this information while considering their rapidly diminishing options. The sophisticated nature of the enemy response suggested knowledge of American extraction procedures and likely landing sites. This meant that any extraction attempt would face organized opposition rather than the random encounters that their planning had anticipated. Chen worked desperately with communication equipment that was becoming less reliable with each passing hour. The interference patterns had evolved throughout their operation, suggesting adaptive jamming technology that could adjust to their attempts to establish communication. His technical expertise was being defeated by adversaries with capabilities that exceeded intelligence estimates. Rodriguez maintained security of her intelligence materials while participating in the team's final tactical planning. The information she had gathered would be valuable only if they survived to deliver it, but abandoning it would mean their mission had failed completely. The weight and bulk of the equipment were becoming more significant as their physical resources diminished. Martinez conducted a detailed assessment of their remaining ammunition and equipment. The team was still well armed and capable of defending themselves, but they lacked the resources for sustained combat operations. Any engagement with enemy forces would need to be brief and decisive to preserve ammunition and maintain mobility. Park monitored the team's physical condition as exhaustion and stress began affecting performance and decision-making. Extended operations at high altitude with limited food and water were taking a toll that could compromise their ability to execute complex procedures. Her medical training helped her identify signs of fatigue that could lead to mistakes or poor judgment. The team established defensive positions around the extraction point as the designated pickup time approached. Electronic equipment that had failed earlier in the mission continued to malfunction, but mechanical systems like weapons and basic survival gear remained functional. They were operating with capabilities that resembled special operations from earlier technological eras. Chen achieved intermittent contact with what appeared to be their command base during the hours before extraction time.